Hello, Biblical Classical community. Welcome back to Elementary Writing 1. In this lesson, lesson number 5, we're going to be talking about weekly lessons in action. The purpose of this lesson is to show the daily routines used every week to give students practice toward mastery. If you'll follow along in the teacher's guide, I am reading from lesson 5. The first section I have here is called Penmanship, Spelling, and Sentences, Scope and Sequence. So for Elementary Writing 1, you're going to focus on these 10 main things. Number 1, you're going to teach the penmanship strokes. Then after that, you'll teach clock letters and select words that go with those clock letters. And I will explain these in detail when we get to lesson 6. The third thing after clock letters is tall line letters, then short line letters, then slant letters, and ending with cross line letters. Once you have taught all of the lowercase letters, then you can introduce children to capital letters. Now, if your child already knows how to write their name, then this will not be their first introduction to capital letters. With teaching the capital letters, you're also going to be teaching 2 to 3 letter words. Then after that, you're going to reinforce capital letters and practice short names, including their own name. This would be the time when you would formally teach them how to write their name if they don't know already. Then after they practice their name, they can move on to easy spelling words that you give them, and I'll explain how to do that in a few minutes. Then lastly, you're going to teach short sentences and questions with 2 to 5 letter words. And again, I'll be explaining that in just a little bit. So the second section in the handbook is called the Penmanship, Spelling, and Sentences Routine. This is where I'm going to explain what you would do every single day that you have class. The first thing you're going to do is practice letters in 2 to 3 tactile ways. And I have several examples on page 6 of the handouts. And you're going to be doing this for 10 to 15 minutes, rotating from one to the other. You want to make sure that students say the sounds of the letter or word as they are writing it in this tactile way. This needs to be a multi-sensory experience where they're using their eyes, their ears, their mouth, and their hands. Then you go to step 3, or the second thing that you're going to do in a given day. After you're done practicing writing with 2 to 3 tactile ways, then you're going to see if the child's ready to sit down with some paper and pencil. You can also look at the handout where I explain how to teach a child what the lines on a paper look like and what they're called. And what you're going to do here is basically practice as many letters, words, or sentences as children are able on one of the handouts. If you choose a particular handout, you might want to start off with just a couple lines of practice a day until the child is able to do an entire page in one sitting. I have some tips for this particular routine. And number 1 is when children have mastered one set of letters, practice 3 to 5 words using those letters by you saying the word, having them say each sound of the word using their fingers, and writing it as they are saying it. So if the word is cat, then you would tell them they need to say each sound, and you can tell them what is the first sound and what is the second sound, what is the third sound, and have them use their fingers. So you can say, what is the first sound? And they can say, k. What is the second sound? Ah. What is the third sound? T. And you want them to point and use their fingers so that they have something that they're discussing, something that their hands could be doing while they're discussing the sounds. And the second tip I have is when children have mastered lower and uppercase letters, begin teaching easy sentences. And I also have a list of some of those on the handouts. Now let's move on to the third part in the teacher's guide, sentence writing technique. On the first day of the sentence lesson, Introduce what a sentence is. You definitely want them to know that a sentence is a complete thought. You could ask them, do you know what a sentence is? And if they don't know, then you can tell them it's a complete thought. It begins with a capital letter, ends with a period, and it must make sense. Show them these features of sentences in books. Show them the beginning and the end of sentences to identify the capital letter and the period. Ask them if it makes sense, and also test their knowledge of that by saying a sentence in a nonsense way as an incomplete sentence and see if they can identify whether it makes sense or not. You could say something like, the book is on the shelf. Does that make sense? Yes. And then you could say a different sentence like the tree yard and ask them if that makes sense. And hopefully they'll be able to tell the difference. In subsequent lessons of the sentence writing technique, you're going to quickly review what a sentence is, what it begins with, what it ends with, and what it must make. It must make sense. And you can do this every time you sit down to do sentences, or even every time you do each sentence that you give them. You could ask them and have them repeat what the answers are to your questions. So then you're going to give them a short sentence similar to what they may have read in a phonics reader, such as a dog ran to his man. And I have a list of a few sentences to sort of give you an idea of what kind of sentences you need to use, and you can find that in the handout. So you're going to give them at least 3 sentences a day to write or to practice. If it's a question that you're teaching them, then you're going to teach them what a question is, and of course, how to make a question mark. And then you can test them on those concepts also. All right, so now we're going to go to the next page in the teacher's guide of lesson 5, and we're going to be talking about the spelling technique. How do I teach spelling? The spelling lesson has 3 sections to it. Written phonogram review. And this is when you choose as many phonograms for practice, at least 3 to 5, as you think the child can handle for the week. So you're going to choose 3 to 5 or more phonograms that you want them to practice writing. Orally review the sounds of the phonograms for the week using flashcards or writing them on a board or pinning a list of the phonograms that you're going to practice for the week on a wall. Then once you have your phonograms chosen and the student has orally reviewed what the sounds are, then you're going to go to practice writing the week's phonograms, and you're going to have them write each phonogram 5 to 10 times, and you're going to make sure that the students are writing them horizontally across the page on the line in the direction that we read and write. We use that phrase a lot because you're going to be teaching them how to use letter spaces between each phonogram. So you want to teach them, would I be able to fit the letter O in that space? If so, then it's enough space between words. You know, you have some students who put a large space in between words, and that's too much. And then you have those that don't put any space, and you just see a whole line of letters. You want to make sure that you're teaching them proper spacing. And at first, you're going to have to do it slow and make sure they take their time. Now, when they're writing the phonogram, they must say the sound as they write it. This activity should be multi-sensory. You want them to hear it, say it, write it, and touch it, which is writing it. The written phonogram review should last maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And then you're going to move on to spelling practice. So let's say you have a page in their journal that they're doing their writing practice, and you practiced 3 to 5 phonograms 10 times on the paper horizontally. Then at the bottom, maybe they'll skip a line and they can start the spelling practice. So you would write each word from the previous week one time, saying the sounds as they write it. If the word has spelling rules or markings, say those markings and rules as you practice before writing the next word. You would give them a list of words from the previous week that you're going to be practicing and have them write them. So they can look at the word, read it, say it, and then write it for practice, making sure that they say the sounds as they're writing it and any markings or rules. The markings and rules are listed in the handout. And you're only going to have them write the word one time on their paper, and you're going to do this with all the words every day for 3 or 4 days before you test them on those practice words. So that would take you maybe 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how many words you have. So far in our spelling lesson, we've been doing writing through phonogram practice, through spelling practice, and now we're going to do new spelling words. This is where I would teach them 3 to 5 new words every day for 3 or 4 days, so that by the end of the week, they have 10 or 15 words that they're going to practice the following week. And this part of the lesson is designed for children to talk about and be introduced to words that they possibly have never seen before. So in the new spelling words part of the lesson, students put their pencils down. They're going to have their paper in front of them. They're going to put their pencils down, and the teacher says the word. Students repeat the word to make sure they heard the word correctly, and they use it in a sentence if they need to make sure they understand and can use the word. After that, the teacher and students use their fingers to sound out the word. Each finger is one letter, and multi-letter phonograms have fingers that touch. So in this new spelling words, you're going to teach them words that they haven't heard before. And let's say the word is shop. I will shop at the store. Shop. So the first sound, so you give them the word, they say the word, make sure they understand the word, and then you're going to ask them, what's the first sound in shop? The first sound is sh, and I teach them to use their left hand because we read from left to right. So if they're looking at their left hand and they say and show sh on their fingers, then they're going to be using their thumb and index finger together, not separate. So sh, what's the first sound? Sh. What's the second sound? Ah. And what's the third sound? P. And now you know that they know what the 3 sounds of the word are, and then you can have them write it. So number 4, students write and say the sounds of the word as they write it and put a space between syllables. So if the word is open, that has 2 syllables. So what's the first syllable? O, and the second syllable is pen. So they would have 2 separate hands for each syllable. And when they write it, they're going to have a letter space in between the syllable. Then after the student writes the word on their paper, then the teacher writes it and says the sounds of the word to model the correct spelling, asks students to compare their word with the teacher's word to make sure they're doing it correctly. Then once the students have written the word correctly, you're going to ask them if it has any markings. Are there any markings? Is the question. That will prompt them to think about what the markings are if you have already taught them. And so at some point before you start the spelling technique, you'll need to teach them 1 or 2 of the markings and practice those. If there are no markings, then you might ask them, are there any rules? And then students can discuss with you what the markings or rules are for that word. And one tip I have for you is when a new marking or rule is introduced, the teacher explains it as it applies to the word. So you don't have to teach them all the rules or markings. You just need to teach them 1 or 2 to get started. and then introduce it as it is found in the word. Then you're going to repeat this process for 5 to 10 new words 3 or 4 days a week. So on Monday, you give them 5 words. On Tuesday, you give them 5 words. And on Wednesday, you give them 5 words. And on Thursday, you give them 5 words. So if you're doing that, you're going to have 15 to 20 words at the end of the week. Now, if you're only doing 2 or 3 words a day, then you would probably only have 10 words for the week. You can decide how many words the child is ready for in one given sitting. Once you're done giving them all the new spelling words, then you're going to end the lesson by having students read the word for spelling and read it for reading. Now, to read the word for spelling, teacher and students simultaneously say the sounds or the syllables of each word. You're not going to be discussing or talking about any of the markings or rules, just the sounds or syllables. Emphasize proper vowel sounds and name any silent letters during this time. So if the word is talk, then they're going to write t, a, ul, k. They're going to write talk, but when they read it for spelling, they're going to say the letter that's silent. So if the word is talk, then they would say t, a, ul, k, talk. So they read it for spelling by emphasizing any silent letters or vowels, because sometimes vowels don't actually say the sounds they're supposed to say in words when you're reading it for reading. Like the word ton, the rock weighs a ton. You hear t, n. But when you say it for spelling, you're going to say t, n, ton. So there's a difference between saying it, reading it for spelling, and reading it for reading. To read for reading, immediately following the read for spelling, students and teacher say the word as in regular speech. And that's what I just explained to you. You would say t, n, ton. So you read it for spelling by saying each sound, and you're emphasizing that vowel sound that's there. And then when you read it for reading, this teaches students to think to spell. So sometimes words aren't always spelled the way they sound, even though that's the main idea with spelling, is writing down the sounds that you hear for the word. Then when Friday comes along, you're going to test your students on the practice words, or when there's been 3 to 4 days of practice. Students are tested on the phonograms also, or just the words that they practiced for the week. They're not going to be tested on the new words. New words become practice words the following week. When students spell a word incorrectly on a test, they have to practice it 5 times, saying the sounds, syllables, markings, and rules as they're writing it right there on their test paper. And that's it for lesson 5, all about weekly lessons in action. We covered what things you're going to be teaching throughout the whole year in the scope and sequence. We talked about the penmanship, spelling, and sentences routine that you're going to practice every day. We talked about the sentence writing technique when you do sit down to practice sentences, what you're going to do there. And then we talked about the spelling technique, what you're going to do when you teach spelling. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.